Hey everyone, my name is Austin. Welcome to the first episode of the Plastic Depth podcast, hosted by yours truly, Frame5 Studios. Some housekeeping in this first episode before we get into things in the future. I have been a podcaster for a while. I started the Frame 100 podcast at this point, 5 or 6 years ago. Did that for a year or so before passing it off to other creators like Gold Brick Productions, Dude Brick, and Trevor Stevens. And that was a fun podcast to be a part of and found. And I always missed doing that after I stopped. And I wanted to do something like that again, but on a little bit more of a deeper level and kind of hosted by just me. And there's a specific thing that I want to make clear with this podcast. Brick filming has been a great medium and a great art style for a lot of different things, whether it's story, comedy, or just overall expression. But something that I have always enjoyed is the ability to create really strong narrative-driven films in the medium of Lego. And I think that that is something that isn't worked on or taken into account as much as it used to be in the earlier years. So what we're going to be talking about pretty much every episode is some of the greatest narrative-infused brick films really over the last 15-20 years. We'll also talk about current films or films maybe a little bit newer in the last year or so and go over what I liked about them, what I maybe didn't like so much, not so much a review, just some topics that I want to talk about that relate to those films. So if that's something that you like, keep listening, because I don't know how often these are going to get made, but we'll go ahead and jump right in. So the first part of this that I want to talk about is the difference between comedy versus narrative-infused films. I think that over the last 8 or 9 years, we've seen a pretty dramatic drop in narrative-infused films, and we see a lot more of your comedy-based brick films, even just short brick films that don't really offer a whole lot outside of the film itself, if that makes sense. I was talking with a couple different community members over the last couple months, and we were trying to figure out how this kind of happened, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't just, older brick filmers who think life was better, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, whatever. And I don't think that's the case. I think there has been a fundamental shift in how most people do brick filming. And I first want to start with YouTube. So for those of you who don't know, I started brick filming back in 2007. And back then, YouTube had just started. I had a different channel prior to this. And brick filming was just definitely a hobby, still is for a lot of people. But the way in which films were done back then is a little bit different than it is today, but I feel like back then you had a lot of people who would take a lot of time to write scripts and create really interesting stories versus now where you don't have as much of that anymore. Or if you do see it, it's really coming from the older brick filmer crowd, which I don't want this to be a new versus old or young versus old debate. That is not relevant here at all. But why I bring it up right now is because I have always gravitated towards more narrative focused brick films, and that can be in an IP film, that can be in a universe of our own creating, and it doesn't really matter what you use. A good example of this from my personal, film archive would be Beta Squad, Grey Republic, that is set in the Star Wars universe, but the questions and the way the story goes, there's a lot of layers to it, a lot of depth that you wouldn't have thought of in Star Wars as much, let alone in a brick film. And those are the films that I think people remember a lot more than your typical lighter comedy tone setting for the most part. I can think of a couple comedy brick films off the bat. Egyptian Holiday comes to mind immediately, where that's something where I will always remember that film very fondly because it was super funny and I was invested in the characters, even though there was only ever one Egyptian Holiday film made, one of the greatest comedy brick films of all time. But I think there is a difference between straight comedy and being able to implement comedic elements into a film without it overshadowing everything else that you do. And I think that part of it is something that isn't around as much. But going back to YouTube back in 2007, 2008, even into the early 2010s, you definitely had people still making less content, but the content was really good. The story was good. The set design, amazing. And it only has gotten better over the years. Camera quality has gotten better. The access to various animating software has increased and improved tremendously. So it's not like back then there was easier access to better grade equipment or tools. Arguably, the tools back then were harder to use and definitely more selective, more expensive. And so when you did see a film that had all sorts of great elements from the visual side and the technical side, it just made the story element that much better. But nowadays, a lot of this stuff is pretty accessible, but there's even less of narrative depth and I would say, to sound like a nerd here or like a film snob, even though I'm not, a lot less of an artistic vision. And this isn't something that I would say matters a ton for the grand scheme of things, because at the end of the day, this is a hobby and people do this because they enjoy it. Who am I to say, okay, hey, you didn't make a film that I liked, therefore your film is bad. That's ridiculous. That's not what I'm saying at all. I just personally enjoy brick films that really take you on a journey. I've never been a fan of brick films that were just 30-second Lego Star Wars lightsaber fight or Lego Ninjago ninja fight or something like that. I just never found those to be pretty interesting. And even back when I would hang out on Bricks in Motion and look at all the films being released, in the last 6 years, I think, even a little longer, let's say 8 years, there was a lot of those types of brick films being put on the forums, and I just wasn't particularly interested. I was like, okay, there's no originality here. There's nothing that I haven't seen before, and there's no reason why I would want to keep watching this. So, I just stopped watching brick films for the most part. I haven't subscribed to a new brick filmer in probably 5 or 6 years. And by new brick filmer, I just mean a new brick film channel. Maybe they've been around for a while, but like to me, they were new. And I don't do that because I think, I'm so much better, something like that. That's ridiculous. I really only subscribe to channels that I know are going to give me some really good narrative content in their brick films. And I think that a lot of people enjoy those types of films as well. But I keep getting off track here for the first episode, right? So YouTube back then was all about hobby, right? And this really gets into the YouTube algorithm a little bit. All of the people who have been in the brick filming community for more than 10 years, like myself, know that it was always a hobby. It was always something that everyone spent a lot of time on. And when a new film would come out, that was Christmas Day, right? Even though it was the middle of July or something like that. And I think that part of it has been kind of forgotten due to YouTube. Not so much like the creators and the people making the brick films, but the way YouTube recommends content and the way YouTube, focuses on certain types of content. Because let's be honest here, guys, no one's watching brick films like every single day. Like, this isn't a hobby or a sector of the internet that gets millions and millions of views per month. It never did. But with how YouTube's search engine and algorithm has changed, it's kind of had a subtle impacts on the brick film community and how we make them, because it didn't matter back 10 years ago if you posted once a year, twice a year, maybe even like every couple months. Like, your channel was growing rapidly back then. Nowadays, you only can grow your YouTube channel really if you're posting consistently and high quality. Now, we can, debate all day about what's quality and what isn't, but YouTube's whole thing is more and more content. And what I've noticed is that you get a lot more brick films, but you get a lot less quality. And I'm not talking about technical quality per se, because I'll be honest, if a story is compelling and well written and there's an emphasis on those elements, the animation part I can usually, put aside. Like, few people remember this, but I was really into walk cycles, right? In the technical side of that, still am. But I don't necessarily care about that as much if the rest of the film is good, is pulling me in. And I just went back to see if there were any examples of this in the past, and there's a lot of it. So one of my favorite brick filmers who no longer creates is Jonathan Vaughn, or back then you would know him as Nick Duran. I absolutely loved his films. Some had comedic elements, but he just had some of the coolest stories, niche stories as well, that no other brick filmer back then was creating. And I think that we don't have that anymore. And I was wondering, why don't we do this anymore as a community? Why don't we do it as much? And I think it's because YouTube makes it hard for those elements, those films, to succeed. Like, if you look up some of the most watched brick films of the last, 5 or 10 years, they're almost always short comedy films or brick films with no substance outside of great animation and great visuals. And that is definitely a part of brick filming. Okay, like that's always going to be part of it. But I don't think that, like, if Nick Duran made a film today, I don't think it would be nearly as popular as other brick films out there who are doing something like Lego City Cops and Robbers Chase, right? Even, who else am I thinking of? I would like early Mind Game Studios. I love Zach. Zach is a great guy, and it was one of my early inspirations for, me animating many years ago. But like, even now, like Zach, Jonathan Vaughn, Nathan Wells, like all of those people made great films that made you think, and they wrote films almost like it was from, this risk of sounding cheesy, like written from the heart, if you will. Four-Line Creature is a more modern example of this, and I just wish that there was more of that all the time. But going back to Jonathan Vaughn, he had an uncanny ability to create narrative-focused films with underlying elements of comedy. And those are films that I wish people made more of. And part of the reason for my exit from the brick filming scene over the last 6 years, was because there was less and less of that. I said it maybe 10 minutes ago where I would be on the forums and it was just a bunch of short comedy sketches that weren't original comedy. It was someone else's that just was repurposed into Lego. And I was like, okay. I'm not interested in that. I have other things to do. And all of my other friends who were animating at the time, like, they all were stopping too. And I don't know why. I came back for the anniversary of THAC, and that was really awesome. Like, I fell in love with brick filming again, or the medium again. And I hope I can make more films, this year, next year, whatever. But I just think that the art form, or the art of brick films, has kind of been put on the back burner, and what has taken its place as far as priority is quantity and subscribers. And for any of you who haven't been on YouTube for a while, and maybe you're just starting your brick filming journey, maybe you've just started your YouTube channel, if you take the time and make really good films, like universally, not by my standards, but like, generally speaking, if you make really good films, the views will come. Something I noticed during THAC this year was a lot of people seemed to be upset that they either didn't get the views they wanted or they didn't get the recognition that they thought they deserved. And while we all, including myself, we all want views, we all want the recognition for the hard work we put into our films. But the way YouTube has kind of done this stuff is they've optimized the crap out of this platform. So even if you make a really good film and someone only watches it for 30 seconds, and then maybe something else comes up, they have to stop and come back to it later, that signals to YouTube apparently that your video isn't good, and so they are going to stop pushing it to people or stop putting it in front of audiences to click on it. And that's not fair to the creator, right? That's not fair to the people that put a lot of time into their films only for them to not get a lot of traction because of a heavily optimized platform. And I would love to see YouTube, and to a more focused extent, the brick film community kind of go back to not a time, because we can't be stuck in the past, right? But I would love to see the community go back to a philosophy of, we want to make great works of art, and no matter how long that takes, we still want to make that type of content for the community, for ourselves, and think less about YouTube. I think that even myself in the mid-2010s got sucked into this, where I used to upload every day, not animations, but like updates after update, few animations, just a lot of updates. And that got me a lot of subscribers. That got me a lot of attention, because people were like, okay, Top Brick Studios, that's what I was known back then at the time, was making a lot of content, and we got subscribed to him because he just keeps making content and tutorials and this and that. And I love doing all that, but I was definitely doing a lot of it because I was like, okay, I can make not a lot of money, but I can get a lot of attention and a lot of views if I keep doing this all the time. And some of my animation began to suffer a little bit, I noticed, from it. And after, I would say, 2020 or so, 2019, actually probably 2018, I was like, okay, I probably should just stop and focus on other things. And we've talked about that before, so I'm not going to talk about it in this podcast episode. But I loved how you could do behind the scenes tutorials and brick films, and you'd get a lot of traction from it. I think you still do that now. You still can. But I think there's still been a little bit of a disconnect in what I'm not the brick film police here, first of all. So but I do think there's been a little bit of a disconnect as to like what technically is a brick film. Like, is a brick film a 30-second or a 1-minute fight scene? Maybe not. I would argue that if I had to think of what my qualifications are for a brick film, it would be story element, obviously the animation, and artistic depth, I guess. I don't know. That would be like my qualifications for a brick film, right? Everything else outside of that, I don't know. I don't find it to be super appealing. And that definitely is different from like a contest perspective, right? If you're doing something specifically for a contest, a great example of this, is Brick Film Day. And you're making these 5 to 20 second animations for the contest. That's completely different. Like that is a contest entry where you're doing something specific for a specific result, right? So let's not, I want to make sure that off the bat, we have some differences there. But what I've noticed in going through channels in the last couple of weeks, kind of preparing for this informal podcast, is that most people aren't making stories anymore. They're just making animations. And I think that's what I really miss. I miss when a lot of creators made stories that you could follow along over the course of a year or multiple years. I'll reference Thack here again. Nick Duran, Jonathan Vaughn, back in the day would do Abduction. That was his series, Abduction. He did 5 of those, and they were for each Thack. So basically 5 years it would take to get the whole Abduction series, done and wrapped up. And that was cool because I would be like, all right, this January, we know Nick Duran is going to be doing another Abduction episode. There were some comedic elements to Abduction, and there was also some story, or a lot of story. And it drew me in every single year. And I would spend months as a teenager, right, just waiting for that next installment. I wish he would have done more like behind the scenes and everything. But those are things I wish a lot of people still did, and I'd like to see more of that in the future. But we haven't talked a lot about a specific film, and that's fine for this first episode. Next episode, we're going to be talking about specific brick films and what was so impactful about them, either back in the day or even now. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little introduction episode. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you are interested in following this along. I don't know when the next episode is. This is very much a hobby, so when I have time, I'll do the next episode. But until then, thanks for watching or listening. I'll see you guys in the next video.